So what we're going to talk today about is biologic threats. And, you know, there's sort of a lot of different things that can go into that. One of them is biowarfare. You heard in my introduction that I've been involved in biodefense while I was in the service, worked at USAMRIID at Fort Detrick for many years. Bioterrorism, which of course is a relatively new threat. We were worried about biowarfare for many years and thought it was primarily a threat on the battlefield, but bioterrorism obviously has a different flavor to it. And emerging disease. And these are things that all have much the same kind of flavor to them, finding countermeasures to them, and some of the problems that they pose with obviously a different onset. So let's get to it. So I'm going to talk pretty fast. And if anybody has any questions, it would not offend me at all. If you want to ask a question, just hold up your hand and let me know to stop and get your question in. And obviously, I'll answer questions at the end. So, 1969, long time ago for a lot of you folks. I was in college in 1969. The Surgeon General of the United States said, it's time to close the book on infectious diseases. We won. We don't have to worry about that anymore. In retrospect, it looks pretty silly, doesn't it? But in those days, why would they have that kind of optimism? We had vaccines and antimicrobials that were working against many of the significant pathogens that we were concerned about as a society, certainly here in the United States. Our hygiene, nutrition, and public health was increasing our life expectancy, and it was making it to where people were, largely healthy, and you did not have to worry so much about infectious disease. We understood vectors. And these are things that would transmit infectious diseases, things like fleas and ticks, and how they interacted in the life cycle of diseases. And we knew a lot of the life cycles of these vectors so that we could intercede in many cases. The agricultural diseases, largely controlled so we can eat like we want to. And, even to the point of being able to overdo it at our choice. And the historic killers, things like smallpox, polio, tuberculosis. These have been largely controlled or even eventually eradicated. And so there was reason for this optimism. Plus, in 1969 was the year the United States decided to unilaterally decide not to participate in offensive biowarfare programs. And in 1975 and 76, in that time frame, the Biowarfare Convention was ratified by the United States, which made, and many other 138 signatories, that made it illegal to use biologic weapons on the battlefield. So there was reason for this optimism about biology and about its use, problematic use. So what is biowarfare? Biowarfare is the intentional use of microorganisms or toxins derived from living organisms to produce death or disease in humans, animals, or plants. You know, I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of our effort and our money goes towards trying to protect humans. Good choice. There are a lot of threats that we pose, that are posed for us, and that's where we should spend the biggest part of our dollar. But there is a significant subset of the threat associated with plants and animals, and we'll touch on that just a little bit. As a veterinarian, we'll talk about at least one project that is ongoing that would give you a face for how important the government feels that threats to animals are. So biowarfare is a state-sponsored activity. This is a capability that a country develops to be able to try to affect an outcome on the battlefield. And we had quite a robust offensive biowarfare program up until 1969, prior to the ratification of the treaty. Bioterrorism is not necessarily so much a state-sponsored activity. This would be the random use of biologic weapons against the public or against any target that the perpetrator might so choose. And it has a different purpose than gaining an advantage on the battlefield. Our offensive programs were trying to counter the asymmetric superiority of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. You know, those gads of tanks that they had, so many more than we did. We might be able to use them in some way to gain an edge on that battlefield. Bioterrorism, however, has a different purpose. Demoralizing a country, exacting revenge, affecting policy. Just have to listen to CNN, probably tonight, and you'll hear those very reasons and those very things that we just said that would be things that are of great concern to us in our country. So what could be the target of a biologic weapon? Well, obviously humans are a very, very important part. The trick is that there are so many different kinds of pathogens and there are so many different ways that they can affect us that it makes developing a countermeasure so very, very difficult. Things like pathogenic diseases, vector-borne diseases, zoonotic diseases. And zoonotic diseases are those diseases that affect both humans and animals, and so makes them much more difficult to control and to counter. And of course toxins, which are chemicals that are produced by biologic agents and really fall into the broad category of biologic agents. So, food, very important potential way to use biologic weapons. And the biologic attacks here in the United States prior to the Anthrax attack with anthrax subsequent to 9/11 had all been perpetrated using food as a weapon. Animals, plants, even material, biologic agents can be used to affect things like fan belts or tires or runways. They're very, very significant things that are done using biotechnology that increase the threat. So one of the challenges of talking about bioterrorism is to try to strike a balance between alerting and informing the public with a realistic view of the risk, without exaggerating or arousing harmful or paralyzing fears. And the fact is, there are probably some people here at the end of my talk that would go, "Oh my God, we should really be worried," and others would go, "Really? That's all he had?" And so everybody is a little bit different in how they perceive the risk or the threat, and how you talk to folks about what these risks and threats are. So when we talk about the threat, it's broad, it's complicated and intertwined. Again, what poses such a challenge to develop countermeasures and try to counter this threat? There are some diseases that are strictly human diseases, and probably the most important one in this respect is smallpox. And I think we'll talk about smallpox in a few minutes in a little bit of an expanded topic. But this is a disease you're going, well, we don't even have smallpox anymore, right? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But only against humans. Now, smallpox has been eradicated. Why is that? It doesn't hide in animals. It doesn't exist in animals, and so we were able to develop a vaccine. You could vaccinate essentially everyone in the world who was at risk, and it was eradicated. Not the case for most of the other organisms. There are animal diseases that only affect animals in some significant way, and one of the most important potential bioterrorist organisms is strictly an animal disease, and that's foot and mouth disease. Does not affect humans, but it is a very, very significant pathogen of animals, and some of the characteristics that we'll talk about in my talk will explain why that one is such a very significant pathogen for us to be concerned about. It's easy to forget about the plant diseases, but obviously one of the things that increases our quality of life here in this country is our ability to produce food and to have a plentiful food supply. And obviously there are significant threats to the food supply to include plants. And of course the zoonotics. Now the zoonotics, as I said before, are diseases that affect both animals and man, and about 80% of the select agents, and select agents is a term we'll talk about a little bit, but these are the ones that the federal government has concluded could be used as weapons. These are biologic agents that could be used as weapons. There are about, 75 or 80 of them. About 80% of them are zoonotic agents that are found both in the agricultural community and in the human community. And so that has significant implications for how you might eradicate or even the access for potential bad guys to biologic agents. And one of the other things is, if you develop a countermeasure for a virus, is that going to work against a bacteria? Probably not. Is it going to work against a toxin? No, it's not. And so you can't have a silver bullet, or at least we have not been able to discover a silver bullet that would protect against these particular kinds of agents. And the fact is that whether you have something that is an intentional weapon that's deployed to try to injure or kill people or to affect our economy, or whether it is a naturally occurring disease, something like SARS or something like avian influenza, we still require a countermeasure. And so there is a very much there are two dogs in the fight here. One of them is for use as a potential weapon, and the other one is naturally emerging disease. We got a big world. It's getting smaller all the time, though, with the kind of travel that we have access to, and with the incursion into places where these novel viruses might be found. And so there's a lot of challenges associated with that. Well, so when we talk about bioterrorism, I think it's safe to say one of the reasons that we're as concerned about this as we are is because of what happened during the Cold War. State-sponsored, well-funded, offensive BW programs that flourished both in the Warsaw Pact and in many, many other countries around the world. And as I said, we had a very robust offensive program up until 1969, looking at the potential use of biologic weapons as a part of our arsenal to affect the battle space. So in 1969, we had a very significant program. We don't know for sure what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, but clearly we have subsequently found out with the dissolution of the Soviet Union that their program ramped up like crazy subsequent to the ratification of the Biowarfare Convention, which again made it illegal to use biologic agents. And it's one of the reasons that we're so concerned now about proliferation, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what are the implications and restraints for a would-be bioweaponeer, someone who wanted to use biologic agents as a potential weapon? Well, first of all, to be effective, you probably want that agent to be presented as a respirable aerosol. That means you want to be able to have an organism that would float through the air through some sort of very efficient means and have people breathe them. Now, there are some very significant biologic agents. If you want to sneak up and inject somebody in the rear, that'll kill them for sure. Probably not really a very significant weapon of mass destruction, though. And when we talk about biologic agents, primarily, especially when we're talking about bioterrorism and biowarfare, I'm talking about weapons of mass destruction, and that would, to me, that would qualify that you can kill tens, hundreds, thousands, 100,000 people with an attack. And clearly that capability exists with many of these organisms that we're concerned of. So, but to make something a respirable aerosol, to make it that weapon, that makes it a weapon of mass destruction rather than something that you might use at a buffet line, you have to prepare and weaponize that particular organism. And doing that, the manipulations that you would do to an organism to make it float in the air, to have the proper dynamics to do that, may jeopardize its viability. It might be able to make somebody breathe it, but it might not make them sick when it gets there. And of course, there are a lot of meteorological conditions that would affect the effectiveness. So, if you wanted to release an aerosol cloud, you better hope that the wind doesn't change directions, because that obviously would not make it nearly as effective. And so that weaponization that we're talking about, for lack of a better term, I'd call that magic. There's some magic involved in that. And these are some of the most closely held of state secrets for various countries, is how to weaponize organisms if they have that capability. And not just any Yahoo with an erector set can do it. It's there's a lot of technology and there's a lot of know-how involved in that. However, with that said, so it's not so easy because there's a lot of science involved. With that said, however, some agents, contagious agents, may be delivered without weaponization. What about smallpox? Well, we were talking about people that are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in the presentation before mine. Okay, so if somebody was able to get a hold of smallpox and become infected, infect themselves, and go on a road trip, I think that would do it. You don't need that magic. You don't need that weaponization that we're talking about. You don't need that heavy-duty science. You just need to have access to the organism. And I would say probably, scanning this audience, most people in here have probably been vaccinated for smallpox. Go down to the college and see how many people have been vaccinated for smallpox. About half the population of the United States is not vaccinated now, has absolutely no protection if there were an outbreak. And we'll talk about, some of the potential problems associated with smallpox in a few minutes. So, and some agents can be delivered by vectors. Many people heard of West Nile or Lyme's disease. These are diseases that have had a significant impact on public health. These are emerging diseases. Significant impact on public health. No magic involved there. They went right across the country. How many people, how many public health people would have thought that California would have seen West Nile cases 10 or 12 or 14 years ago? Probably not very many, because most people didn't believe that they would jump over the mountains like they have. So these vector-borne diseases, of which there are a number that would be very, very significant. How about, those very same vectors that love West Nile would absolutely be enthralled with Rift Valley fever, which would be a disease that is one that we're very concerned about within the biodefense community and in the agricultural community, because it would be worse both in the agricultural and in the public health community if Rift Valley fever were to be found here. So with those diseases, there's little or no magic involved. You don't have to have a pointy-eared scientist to make those kinds of things very, very effective as a weapon. So biologic agents are really the silent enemy. Talked about responders and talked about people going to the hospital because they saw an attack in the previous presentation. Well, if I were to be able to perpetrate a biologic attack in this room today by shaking a little vial of anthrax or something that was weaponized, and I could get something to float, there wouldn't be any bang. There wouldn't be any people going to the hospital today. But in 3 or 4 days, or 2.5 days or so, people would start going to the hospital. There would be no signalment that something was going on. And so it's one of the reasons that there's been so much technology and time and effort put into detectors and trying to figure out if there's been an attack, and looking at surveillance programs that would detect clusters of respiratory disease, say, or vesicular disease, which would cause blisters on your skin. Those kinds of things. There are a lot of programs trying to figure out if someone can see a cluster of those events, because guess what? You can't tell that an attack has taken place until the perpetrator is sunning themselves on the beach someplace and are completely gone. And so another reason why this is problematic, the guy doesn't have to blow himself up to be able to do it if he has the right technology. So the longer an attack goes undetected, the more serious it becomes. And for early detection and intervention, we have programs like BioShield and these other syndromic surveillance programs that I alluded to try to determine if an attack has taken place. And of course, one of the biggest problems is, was there really an attack, or is this just an emerging disease? And of course, plausible deniability is a big part of using a biologic agent. You could say, well, I didn't do it. In fact, there wasn't an attack at all. This is a classic emerging disease. It's not something that would even signal, in some cases, that a perpetrator was involved. So, the Defense Science Board is a group of experts at the national level whose business it is to look at national security issues and try to keep the United States government at the foredge of biotechnology. And in 2002, they concluded that biodefense is the single most significant modern challenge to U.S. sovereignty. Now you think about that. That is a big term. That's a big thing to say. And why would they even consider something like that? Well, biologic weapons can be delivered by the few. In fact, most people believe that one person perpetrated the anthrax attack, which only killed 5 people and sickened 17, but resulted in the outlay of the federal government of billions and billions of dollars to try to help prevent something like that reoccurring. So it doesn't take a cast of hundreds. It can only take perhaps even one person. They present a small signature for which we have an ill-developed capability to detect. That means that if I'm going to make a nuclear weapon, there are going to be satellites that pick up that something crazy is going on, in your, on your ranch. If you're going to make a chemical weapon, there's going to be a big signalment that something is going on. You're buying stuff that is that's crazy. If you're going to do something with a biologic agent with commercially available bioreactors and things that you can get without a raised eyebrow in your basement, you could make a biologic weapon if you had the right cookbook. And so that's one of the things, again, that makes detection of a potential problem so very, very difficult. Conventional concepts of deterrence are not necessarily effective. So I contend to you that we have the finest military in the world, and on the conventional battlefield, nobody can resist our will with our military. So with all of that combat power, with all of our effectiveness, how much deterrent was that to someone using a biologic agent and with impunity killing people? Zero deterrence. Zero deterrence to having all of our military infrastructure if someone were to use one of these biologic agents, because who are you going to bomb? Who are you going to retaliate against? Very, very, very difficult, and that asymmetry would be very appealing to a terrorist. And we have limited response capability. You know, I think an audience like this would know that many people want to believe that we have rooms the size of this one with people standing there with their backpack ready to go. You know, when the weather turns bad or when there's some sort of an event. And if we were to have massive events, those things we don't have that kind of response capability. And you know the old saying that every emergency is going to be a local event, and that's going to be the case if we were to have a widespread event. So biotechnology is one of our greatest tools. We are hanging lots of our hats on how we're going to counter bioterrorism and biowarfare on biotechnology. But while a quote from a member of the Defense Science Board, biotechnology is about to lose its innocence in a big way. While physics dominated weapons production of the 20th century, biology dominated weapons of the 21st, and we already have some very interesting examples of that. There's a group of scientists at New York University, Stony Brook, who made poliovirus. Of course, poliovirus, very serious virus, made poliovirus from a cocktail on the web. They did not use the organism itself. They constructed this virus synthetically. It was real polio. It infected animals and caused the paralysis that is indicative of polio. And so that took them, however, 3 years to do that using biotechnology available at the time that this happened. This is in the late 1990s. And so that's a little bit disturbing that somebody could make an organism without actually having it, make a pathogenic organism. Well, this has happened many times now, but another group made a less recognizable virus from scratch, and with existing technology, it took about 2 weeks to do. So this rolling edge of biotechnology and this capability that is available to people who who knows who they could be, is a very, very significant problem within the biodefense community. There's the story of the Mouse Pox supervirus. Mouse Pox is a pox virus. It's related to Smallpox, related to monkeypox, related to camel pox, and this is a disease that is a very significant disease of mice. In the late 1990s, the Australians decided that they were going to limit the mice that were affecting their agricultural programs. So they took mouse pox and they modified it to try to make it more pathogenic, so it was a more efficient killer of mice. And were they ever successful? They took a disease that was around 50% mortality to susceptible mice, and they made it 100% effective and killed every mouse it infected. And this new mouse pox virus defeated a very efficient mousepox vaccine that protected mice. Well, I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to understand why that might be problematic. So who's to say somebody hasn't taken smallpox and developed a new smallpox that defeats our vaccine, which allowed our public health officials here in around the world to eradicate it. And so that's a very, very significant capability, and that capability is 10 or 12 years old. To be able to do that. And there's an interesting story about the 1918 Spanish flu. Of course, the 1918 pandemic flu occurred at the tail end of the First World War, and it is very much the thing that is sort of the boogeyman for flu people. And when people are worried about pandemic flu, and so this killed about 50 to Who knows exactly how much in 1918, but some estimates up to 150 million people. Clearly lots more people than died in the First World War. So scientists wanted to figure out what this flu virus was exactly, but they didn't have a sample of it. So they decided to try to re-engineer it, and they found flu virus in jars at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C., and they got some of the genome of the smallpox virus from these soldiers that had died in the First World War, and then they went to the North Slope in Alaska. They found a village that was in the permafrost area. There was a village of Inuits there there were 70 people that lived in this village. 67 of them died from the 1918 pandemic flu, and they were given permission to exhume several of these bodies, and they were able to reconstruct the 1918 pandemic flu virus that killed, certainly tens and tens and tens of millions of people. Well, there are a lot of reasons to do that, but looking at it from a problematic aspect, the fact that we can do things like that now are extremely worrisome, and something that we have to be able to, to try to rationalize and to try to control. Well, and just more recently with pandemic H1N1, and this is the last pandemic flu that we went through in the last couple years. There are a group in Wisconsin and in the Netherlands. Remember 4 or 5 years ago, avian influenza was all the rage. The thing that happened with avian influenza, to be a pandemic strain, it needs to be pathogenic. It needs to kill people. Check that for pandemic influenza or for H5N1. It has to be available and has to be transmissible. That particular agent was not transmissible between people. They modified the H5N1 to make it transmissible and to have all of the characteristics. So here's an organism that was achieved with that third virulence factor, with that factor that made it transmissible. And so, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the scientists that are doing that kind of work? And I'm saying, it's something that we need to do. But if we look at today, 1913 or 2013, if we think about what it's going to be like in 2020, 2030, 2050, this technology is never going to stop. It is always going to be advancing, and this is going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with within the biodefense and the response community from here on out. So what's the state of U.S. biodefense? Tara O'Toole, testifying before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs a couple years ago, said there are no technical barriers to a large-scale bioattack. Knowledge and tools are increasingly accessible to virtually anyone who has the will to try to get them. We can manipulate pathogens' characteristics and synthesize viruses from scratch. Procedures will inexorably become simpler and more available across the globe of technology as technology continues to mature, and technical expertise required in the restrictions limiting the acquisition of materials necessary for production make this a challenging task. So that's really, those are really some of the very, very important things associated with dealing with this. Even a small-scale attack could be highly lethal and disruptive. And again, if we go back to the Anthrax attack, we could see 5 people killed on in a car wreck on the interstate today if we were out on it. And that's how many people were killed with the Anthrax attack. But think of the turmoil that caused when it happened. There's a real possibility of bioattacks on multiple targets because biologic agents are a self-replicating organism. So if you were able to buy a nuclear device, that's a one-shot deal. Biologic agents, if you're able to make a weapon, you can make another one. And you can keep making them. And you can have a reload capability associated with it. And a nation need not maintain or stockpile large numbers of bioweapons. Again, this is your Tara O'Toole's words to Senate subcommittee. So that's a lot of bad news that I just gave you. So is it prudence or paranoia for me to say, wow, we should really be, we should really be worried? And, as I think you can tell already, I'm probably in that camp, that we should be worried and we should be paying attention and trying to go forward on these issues. But there's another side to the story. Is it prudence or paranoia what happened with camelpox? And this is a good example of how difficult it is to deal with biologic weapons and potential proliferation. So, camelpox is a virus, and this is related to mouse pox, which we talked about, and we've talked about smallpox and monkeypox. And it is a disease of camels and dromedary camels primarily. So there was an Iraqi weapons lab in Iraq that was using camelpox, and they had the capability to genetically modify camelpox. So why were they using camelpox in their in one of their genetic laboratories? Well, could it be that camelpox could be a primary human pathogen for those of us who aren't in an endemic area where camelpox is found? So few of you probably have camels or have access to camels, I would suspect. And so it is a human pathogen, and we don't have any natural immunity to camelpox. So maybe it would be useful as a weapon as camelpox. Probably not. Could it be that they could genetically modify camelpox to make it a real pathogen, to make it more smallpox-like? Well, you know, if I'm concerned about this, and when I'm looking at it, and I know the DoD during this period of time thought that this is one of the very real possibilities associated with it. So this is, this is something that could happen. Could it be that this camelpox was a lab surrogate for variola, which is the real smallpox? And so you could do your R&D, you could do your scale, you could do your scale up, you could figure out how to aerosolize this with a relatively non-pathogenic organism. And if you ever wanted to really, have the balloon float up, then you could substitute smallpox that you'd either stolen or purchased or gotten your hands on somehow and have a real live, big-time biologic weapons. This is one of the things that the DoD was really concerned about too. Or, in Iraq and Southwest Asia, maybe they're worried about their camels. This is a significant pathogen of camels. And so it may have been that this was work that was ongoing just because it was an agricultural pathogen and they were trying to improve their economy. And this is the problem, is that you have legitimate reasons for working on these organisms and you can't tell the differences. My friend Dave Franz used to say, we can't measure intent. We don't have an intent meter. And if you can't tell what the intent of somebody's reason for working on something is, then you can't draw accurate conclusions for why it is that they're going to do it. I would say about camelpox, though, is that it may be paranoid to say this, but remember, it's not paranoia if they're really out to get you. And there are clearly people in that part of the world who have said, we're going to get you if we can figure it out. And clearly with the terrorist side of business, they have clearly put their stake in the ground that if we can get access to biologic weapons and we can figure out how to make them kill a lot of people, we're going to use them. And so we have to be concerned that that's the case. So, we really got fooled in Iraq. And it's, many people trying to figure out exactly how that happened, but that last example I gave you is a good one. But we know what happened in the Soviet Union. We knew, back in the 80s and into the 90s, we knew the Soviets had a big offensive BW program. We figured it was probably sophisticated, but we had no idea. There was a guy came out of the Soviet Union. There were a couple of them that came out at about the same time. One went to England and one came to the United States. And what they told us when they came out of their offensive program absolutely stood our biodefense programs on our ears. We knew they were big, we knew they were sophisticated, but we had no idea. He said there were as many as 60,000 scientists and technicians in the Soviet Union working on offensive biowarfare programs. 60,000. Now let me contrast that with, and let's just say Dr. Alibek, Dr. Alibekov, who is the second-ranking scientist in their offensive BW program. Maybe he was trying to ratchet up sales for his book, which he wrote subsequent to this. And maybe it was only 45,000 of these scientists and technicians working these programs. So let me contrast that with you with our defensive programs here in the United States. I worked at USAMRIID at Fort Detrick for many years. That's the only place in the United States where we were working on countermeasures to biowarfare. We had 500 people working there. 500 people trying to figure out how to protect against biologic agents, and tens of thousands certainly tens of thousands, working in ways to optimize the use of biologic agents as weapons. The other thing he talked about is he estimated that there were as many as 10,000 people working in their offensive bioterrorism program, looking at ways to affect the economies. You know, I talked about our old offensive BW program. We did a lot of work in wheat and rice. I wonder why that was during the Cold War. So those are the kind of pathogens that you would use to try to degrade the capability of a country to wage war or to inflict their will somehow. So the potential for so where are those 60,000 scientists and technicians? Where'd they go? Well, a lot of them are at universities here in the United States, and a lot of them are all over the world in various other countries, and so that's proliferation. And so I think, you know, that's one of the reasons that we are so concerned about what went on back in the Soviet Union. They're gone, right? Well, you know, I'm a believer that their offensive BW programs aren't necessarily gone, but they're huge programs, and those massive programs have gone. So when we talk about proliferation, I think this, this little anecdote shows the crux of the proliferation problem. So this is a quote by a guy who is a veterinarian, and he was a participant, one of the lead scientists in a project called Project Coast, which is a South African offensive BW program. They were building genetic weapons to kill ethnic groups that would target ethnic groups in South Africa prior to the demise of the apartheid regime. And he said, if you're not financially independent, it influences your moral decision making. Well, in English, that says, hey, if I need the money, even if I don't want to be a bad guy, I might be able to do it. And so, you know, having met some of these folks that were part of the old offensive program, you know, they're just like you and me. They have a family. They'd like to have another car. They'd like to, have a bigger apartment. And if they're one of the people who has the magic, either knows how to make biologic weapons because of the massive scope of their programs, or they have access to pathogens that had been prepared or engineered by as part of their old offensive program, and somebody said, "Hey, you know, we're going to pay you X amount to come and do that." Well, that's a pretty powerful incentive. So this is something that came out in 2004, and I know that the life in Russia has gotten a lot better since then. But still, it says here that the average Russian scientist in 2004 was making $137 a month. I'll tell you, they don't pay that bad at K-State. We even make more than this. So if somebody came along and offered you $30,000 to come to Iraq, or to come to Iran, or to some other rogue nation, it would be pretty hard to turn down, and that really is at the heart of the proliferation problem. So Dr. Alabek told us that they stockpiled hundreds of tons of anthrax, dozens of tons of plague, dozens of tons of smallpox. Oh, wait a minute. I thought there were only 2 places left in the whole world with smallpox, that little box they got down to CDC, and over in Vector in Novosibirsk, Russia, they had tons of smallpox. So color me skeptical that it's all gone, that there's no place else to get smallpox. Because I think, and again, this is my opinion, I think it's wildly optimistic to believe that smallpox is only in the places that they said. And so how dangerous is autonomous anthrax? Well, Dr. Alabek says they're aerobiologists, and I think our aerobiologists here in the United States would agree that 1 gram, 1/28th of an ounce of purified anthrax, this is the real stuff now that has the magic, not just anybody can do it. This is a very, very exclusive club that could make something like this. Could hold up to 100 billion spores, and that if all of those spores got into a susceptible host, it could kill 10 million people. Now, it's not all going to get there, and a lot of it certainly won't, but just that's an example of how lethal this stuff can be. So what that means is Had the anthrax perpetrator put that much, so about how much was in those letters that were sent to Daschle and some of the other luminaries who got those? 1 to 2 grams of this kind of anthrax were in those letters. Had that gone into the air handling system of the Hart building, probably would have killed a lot of people. And that would have been a very, very significant thing. And I can tell you something else. If you're trying to kill people with anthrax, you don't put them in a letter and then with a note that says, you've been exposed to anthrax. You're going to die. You better get to the hospital. That's not how you kill people with anthrax, because obviously if we learned, I think most people learned that with anthrax especially, you have that period where you can go, and fortunately we have a countermeasure that works against anthrax in most cases. So it's the pulmonary anthrax that we're worried about, not necessarily the gastrointestinal that you would get if you ate contaminated food, anthrax-contaminated food, or cutaneous anthrax, which is called, anthrax is called wool sorter's disease because people in New England in these big woolen mills used to get cutaneous and gastrointestinal anthrax, and it was an occupational hazard because sheep would come in and these spores would be on their wool. But it's the pulmonary that has an up to 80% mortality that we're most concerned about. And anthrax is the Cadillac of biologic agents. And one of the reasons is because if I'm dying of anthrax and I still came and gave this talk, all of you are safe. You're not going to get anthrax from me because it is not contagious from one person to the other. So it can literally be used like a bomb. And so weaponized by virtually all of the major offensive BW programs, and it's not contagious. So I'm going to throw plague in here. Plague is the same kind of thing that if you go camping in the mountains, and you don't keep the rodents out of your tent with fleas, you could get plague, and that's a very, very serious disease. But plague is one of those diseases that also can be weaponized and be presented in an aerosol cloud, and could have the potential to kill 100,000 people in a major city, in a major population area. So very, very high consequence pathogen. Ricin, this is a toxin. How hard would it be to get ricin? Make it out of castor beans. And there are recipes on the web for how to do that. So this is a very, very potent toxin, and it's one of the ones that we're very concerned about within the biodefense community. And within the bioterrorism community also. Just throw in glanders here. This may well be. Glanders is a very significant disease of horses. This is one of the first diseases that's known in the 20th century to be used as a biowarfare agent. There was a physician living in Washington, D.C. During the First World War, and he was a German physician, and he decided to enhance the war-fighting capability of the Germans, and he decided he was going to infect horses with glanders being deployed to Europe. And he infected horses with glanders, and he hoped that it would kill as many mules, and as many people as he could. And he was one of the first, bioweaponeers, certainly of the 20th century. And that is also one of the diseases that could be weaponized. A lot of these diseases don't kill you, that are very efficient and desirable as biowarfare agents. And you know why? Because a sick guy is a lot more drag on an army than a dead guy. And so many of these diseases, they don't necessarily kill you, they just make you want to die. And so it really degrades the capability of a combatant to keep going. Botulinum toxin, most people have heard of botulism. Weaponized again by major powers. The Omshiriko got a lot of press for using sarin, which is a nerve gas in the subway in Japan. They also tried to use botulinum. They tried to use Ebola. They went and tried to get Ebola in Africa during the 1976 outbreak. And so these particular guys tried to aerosolize botulinum toxin also. And so there have been some studies that would show that a couple grams of botulinum toxin in a bulk milk tank, in a bulk milk truck coming from a dairy, enough of that would evade pasteurization to kill thousands of people. And so That's something that nobody really knows for sure if that would happen, but you know, and I think that data is controversial in some ways. But again, to think how many, you know, how much security do we have on bulk milk trucks? Not very much. This is an organism that is available, you know, in the dirt. It is not something that you would necessarily have to get out of a lab. So once again, something that's you know, something that would be widely available and with the right intent would be problematic. So foot and mouth disease. I mentioned foot and mouth disease. This is a disease that affects only cattle. It's not pathogenic to humans. Exceptionally contagious. There are some reports that foot and mouth disease can be contagious within 50 miles. I don't necessarily believe that myself, but it is very, very contagious. The most contagious virus many people attribute to. It would have huge consequences. So if we were to detect a case of foot and mouth disease in the United States today, immediately our exports of beef would stop. And that's about 11% of our production. So that would have a huge impact here in the United States. This is endemic in on three continents. It's not found in North America, and it's not found in Antarctica. But it is endemic or found routinely in other countries, easy enough to find, easy enough to get in Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia. And so, you know, frankly, I don't know why this hasn't gotten to the United States already. But it is the top priority within the ag community to find a way to counter foot and mouth disease. Okay, smallpox, more historical deaths than plague, and all wars combined from smallpox. And 1977 was the last case. And you know, the worldwide reservoir is only man, and that's one of the reasons that we were able to eradicate. What about novel or engineered pathogens? You know, all the stuff I've been talking about, these are the oldies but the goodies. These are the ones we were concerned about in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and in the 80s, and even into the 90s. But what about new pathogens with all this biotechnology that we have now? Biotechnology advances make assumptions about behavior characteristics of pathogens really problematic. We can change the availability, the infectivity, the virulence, or the resistance, the persistence of the agent in the environment, how we detect it, or the effectiveness of countermeasures. In other words, the ability is very real to defeat vaccines that work against traditional organisms. So we can have a spectacular public health success like we had with smallpox. So in 1979, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated. Vaccination at that time stopped. Immunity wanes. So what that means is those of us who have been vaccinated, we don't know if we're protected or not because, you know, many people were vaccinated in the 70s, and those who've been in the military or in some organizations have been immunized, but we don't know just how protective that is. And the vulnerabilities increase to an organism. It creates a spectacular biowarfare opportunity. By the way, guess who was one of the prime drivers of the eradication of smallpox? The Soviets. They put a lot of time and effort and emphasis into doing it. What an opportunity. Now that nobody is vaccinated against it, and we're going to produce smallpox as a significant biowarfare agent, one of our battle strains of biologic organism. And it creates a spectacular biowarfare opportunity. And the Soviets were a strong proponent of eradication while concurrently weaponizing smallpox in their programs. So this is vector. Novosibirsk in Siberia, and this is one of the last two known repositories of smallpox. So after 9/11, there were a lot of talk about smallpox subsequent to 9/11 and whether or not we should vaccinate against smallpox, because there was a real concern within the public health and the biodefense community that smallpox might be deployed as a weapon. So the guy who is the director of this in Russia had been the director of the smallpox biowarfare effort during the Cold War. And so he was asked about smallpox vaccination, and he said, you know, he actually has smallpox, and they said, well, what do you think we should do about vaccinating against smallpox? And this guy said, if it were up to me, I think every person in the world should be vaccinated against smallpox. Well, it doesn't sound to me like he's the only guy who thinks he has the key to the box. You know, to say, I think everybody should be vaccinated, And in my view, I think the smallpox issue is one that is very, very significant. So when we talk about vaccinate, I'm a big vaccination proponent. When I worked at USAMRIID, we had a lot of biosafety level 3 laboratories, and those are ones where you actually have a vaccine, usually, that you can use to go in. And so when I retired from the Army, I've had 54 of these vaccinations, these IND vaccinations primarily, that aren't licensed, but makes it great because you can go out and party on Saturday night and fall down and eat all that dirt, no problem. You've got plenty of protection. But people don't just like to line up to get vaccinated. And I'd never heard this before, but when I was, somebody pointed this out to me. So in 1976, how many people remember the Swine Flu Scare of 1976? That's been a long time ago, but there was a real concern that it was the next big one. The big pandemic was coming. So in 1976, President Ford decided, hey, we have a significant public health issue. We are going to vaccinate the United States against swine flu. And so with 100 million people immunized, by the second day after immunization for swine flu, there would be 2,300 strokes, there would be 7,000 heart attacks. Within a week after that immunization, 45 are going to die of encephalitis, and 9,000 will develop pneumonia, and 900 of them would die. That's if they didn't even get vaccinated. So if they lined you up and said, we're going to vaccinate you for, for this, and you were one of the people who had a stroke or had a heart attack, what are you going to think? Or what are your heirs going to think? They're going to think, wow, it was that vaccine. And so who can blame someone for assuming the events are linked and the presumption of tort and liability problem to be expected? And they were still litigating this issue into the 90s. The mandatory vaccination or the suggested vaccination by the government for swine flu. So it's easy enough for me to say we should vaccinate, but these issues associated with liability are tremendous within the biodefense community. It was a legal and political disaster. Just one anecdote that I always find fascinating is in 1998, they had a reunion at Fort Detrick of what they called the White Coat Brigade. And this was a group of people that during the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s were medical research volunteers who were conscientious objectors. So back when you had the draft, and you were drafted, if you were a conscientious objector, one of the options was to become a medical research volunteer. And so you see those guys standing around the 8-ball there, and so they're looking through windows, and inside that huge steel sphere, there were seats that went all the way around, and these guys would sit on the inside of this, and they would aerosolize these organisms. Anybody have any idea how far this would get today? It would get you right to Leavenworth, I can guarantee you that. But these guys had a reunion, and I went to a couple of their events just to hear sort of the dynamic. And boy, these guys were, they were patriots, and they're going, it was, we were doing our part, and and you're just thinking, just how far have we come, to do that. And we're not talking about anthrax and things that would kill people. We're talking about these other ones that made you want to die because they made you so sick. But this burned down in the 80s, and this one is probably our most infamous artifact from our old offensive program. This is Building 470, the anthrax pilot plant at Fort Detrick. Once again, this is right on campus there. And so, if you took the bricks off of this building, you'd see a 3.5-story tall fermenter that was designed to make anthrax in these kinds of quantities that we're talking about. And so in 1969, when Richard Nixon came to Fort Detrick, and unilaterally, literally without much fanfare to the people that were working in the old offensive program, they abolished the offensive program and went strictly to trying to find defensive ways to protect against biowarfare, and they gave up this building and all the rest of the offensive BW infrastructure to the National Cancer Institute. And he said to the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the institutes at the NIH, hey, we have all these really cool buildings here. Why don't you take over? In fact, this one would make a really nice office building, and you guys can have it. And of course, the NIH said, yeah, really? We're going to take over the anthrax pilot plant, because, of course, it would be impossible to completely verify that there were no anthrax spores left in this building. And so it sat there for 25 or 30 years, and in, let's just say, 2003, this particular building was finally demolished. And I can't tell you how many times, living in Frederick, Maryland, I would have people, they'd say, oh, you work up at Fort Detrick. I'd say, yeah. I said, I heard that building they got up there, there's bodies in there. And, if you walk in there, you're dead. And, that's sort of the dynamic you get with, with people in the communities and in places that have these, have this kind of defense infrastructure. And, of course, we were in this building a lot of times, and I never saw a body, and I didn't look in there, in every locker. But it was fascinating, because you go in here, and it was just like a time capsule. 1969, the 1969 calendars were on the wall. You'd open up a locker, and there'd be a pair of Converse All-Stars in there that were popular back in 1969. So, but this particular building went to the NIH and was finally demolished. So we had a paradigm shift in 2001. Prior to that, most people really didn't know much about biodefense. Why would you? We weren't concerned about things here on the homeland, and that was something that the military had to worry about, over in the folded gap someplace. But clearly the biologic threat has changed. During the Cold War, we were concerned about tactical use on the battlefield, at least that's what we were thinking, and against strategic use against the U.S. mainland, which Dr. Alabek told us they were going to use biologic agents, by the way. This is one of the things he told us when he defected. We're going to load them in rockets, and we're going to send them over here. And with as much defense infrastructure as you have here in Monterey, I would suspect that Monterey would be one of the places that would be a potential target. But roughly coinciding with the Gulf War and the dissolution of the USSR, terrorist use against civilian populations or against military, at least domestic targets, became much more of a concern. And this geopolitical asymmetry of being able to use biologic agents, again, without the fear of retaliation by someone who is attacked, because you can't figure out who to retaliate against. So when we talk about these organisms, this is a slide that just sort of shows the kinds of things that we're talking about. Anthrax, plague, smallpox, tularemia, the viral hemorrhagic fevers, things like Marburg, Ebola, Lassa fever, Machupo glanders, melioidosis, psittacosis, Q fever. Now, many of you who are familiar with all of these, they're classic veterinary diseases, almost all of them. These are diseases, the ones that we're talking about that are on that category A, which are the most dangerous. Those are exotic agents, or ones that are exceptionally dangerous. But these are just sort of give you an example of how many different diseases we have to be concerned about. And those are just the public health diseases. We have others that are things like foot and mouth disease, rinderpest, hog cholera, African swine fever. Those are obviously animal diseases, but they are on these lists too. Make it very, very difficult. We need countermeasures against all of them. So when we look at risk is agent, target, and delivery dependent. So if we were to have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease here in California, that's going to be a lot different than an anthrax outbreak that would happen as a result of an aerosol attack using anthrax. And that would be completely different than somebody who would contaminate meat and try to get people to eat it and kill a handful of people that way, or perhaps someone who might infect mosquitoes with Rift Valley fever virus and release it into the environment. So risk is agent, target, and delivery dependent. So why agricultural targets? Just touch on this for a second. It's not about killing cows, that's for sure. These are weapons that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars against the senior advisor for weapons of mass destruction at DHS. And a concerted attack, even with something like foot and mouth disease virus, would cost us big time, big bank. And so, the food or water supply is certainly vulnerable. Lower tech, lower profile for detection, easier and safer delivery, probable deniability, reduced moral and ethical burden. I'm only killing animals, I'm not killing people. And, of course, personal safety. If you're going to make an attack with foot and mouth disease, you're not taking a chance on killing yourself because you're using an organism that is very significant. former president at my university used to love to say that the great engine of our prosperity here in the United States is our ability to produce safe, plentiful, and inexpensive food, and that creates the discretionary spending that drives the American standard of living. So that dime or 12 cents we spend for every dollar that we make here in the United States that we spend on food, rather than the 20, the 30, the 40, the 50, the 60 cents, that the further you go into the emerging world that people have to spend on their food, drives our standard of living here. And if you do something to affect that, you've affected the national security of the United States by decrementing our ability to produce food. So how hard would it really be to be a bad guy, to be a bioweaponeer? This is an interesting case from Australia. In 1997, the Australian Initiative to Biocontrol Rabbits. These are the same guys, by the way, that were working with the Mouse Pox that we talked about before, that created that defeated the Mouse Pox vaccine. So they decided to control the rabbits. You know, when they took all those guys down from England and Ireland and Wales down to Australia, they brought rabbits with them, and for food. And so the rabbits have gotten out of hand, and they were very bad for the agriculture. So they took a virus, which is called a Efficacy virus. This is a virus that's a very significant pathogen in rabbits, but does not affect humans. And they infected these rabbits with this virus to try to control their population. It worked. So New Zealand said, they had some farmers over there, and they said, hey, what the heck? We hate the rabbits too. They're making it hard for me to make a living here, and so we'd like to introduce this Efficacy virus into New Zealand. Well, the New Zealand government has a much stricter biosecurity than the Australians, more conservative, and they said, no, we're not going to let you introduce this because who knows what this virus might do to some of our other wildlife. And so these guys said, well, the heck with it, we're going to go get it ourselves. And so a couple of these guys, they went over to Australia, and they illegally introduced the virus, and they brought him into New Zealand in 3 ways. They mailed it, the virus. They brought it in a vial in a guy's sock, and they had a drenched handkerchief in a guy's pocket. They went to his farm. They mixed it up into a bunch of food that rabbits would do. They took it out and they dumped it on their ranch and introduced it into that country, and it became endemic in the rabbits in that country. So, no disrespect to these guys, but molecular biology, sophisticated biotechnology, state sponsorship, or rocket science was not involved in this. They decided they wanted to do it. They figured out where to go get it, and they did it. And that's how hard it would be. And that's a disturbing model for many of these diseases that we're talking about. That's how hard it would be to introduce these diseases. So when we're talking about terrorism, let's talk about the face of terror. This guy's not in play anymore. But what about these other 2 folks? So this is Ingrid Newkirk, who's the executive president of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And following the very, very significant foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United Kingdom that cost them tens of billions of dollars, she was all over saying, wow, what a great deal it would be if we could get foot and mouth disease virus in the United States. We would put these evil ranchers out of business, and everybody could eat the spinach, and everybody would be a lot healthier. So is she a terrorist? Well, probably not, but she certainly rubs shoulders with people who are. This is one of her cohorts who's associated with PETA and the Animal Liberation Front. This guy is a thoracic trauma surgeon here in California, named Jerry Jaax. He's a spokesman for the Animal Liberation Front, and he doesn't believe that we should use animals in any kind of projects. And so he says, how would we discourage people from doing research using animals? And his solution is, we should just kill 10 or 15 scientists randomly. If we killed enough of them, then the ones who were left would say, I think I'm going to buy a gas station. I'm going to get out of biomedical research. I'm not going to try to find ways to cure these diseases. And of course, what he is doing essentially is saying, especially for these projects where we are talking about dangerous organisms. So we've done a lot of work with Ebola. And there's a very promising new vaccine for Ebola out there right now that's ready to go into testing. How many people want to do an efficacy test for an Ebola vaccine? That means we vaccinate you and then we expose you to Ebola to see how it works. Anybody here want to sign up for that, baby? I don't think so. So it's one of the reasons that animal models are so important. But this guy, he's decided that the mice are more important than trying to find those kinds of disease preventions. And so the testing for these diseases really requires that kind of thing. And the FBI, now I don't know if this is still true, but 3 or 4 years ago, the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front were considered to be the top domestic foreign threat, or the top domestic terrorist threats in the United States. And they clearly have some bad guys that are part of their programs. So what are we going to do? We have all this stuff that we have to be concerned about, these ominous threats to our national security. Intelligence, surveillance, enhanced international cooperation is very, very important. I'm a big fan of catching the bad guys. If we can figure out who might be involved in these kinds of programs, we have to try to find them. And consequence management and response, rapid response and incident response. I can tell you that since 9/11, there has been a huge improvement in what our capabilities might be. So, but most of these things are dependent upon dollars, facilities, and personnel, and we're talking big dollars associated with that. We need to have a coordinated collaborative partnership between the government, industry, academia, and to include local and state government. So one of the things that, one of the upsides of this, we talked about smallpox being eradicated. Well, rinderpest, which is a very, very significant, it's a cattle plague. This has also been eradicated within the last year, and it shows you what the end game is for trying to find countermeasures to various diseases. Again, this is a cattle disease, not something that would hide in some other portion of the world. So there are a lot of things we can do. We have proactive measures, which are developing vaccines, prophylactics, enhanced resistance, coordination and training, developing biosecurity programs, response and preparation, and all the stuff that goes with it. And after an attack, the incident management and all the stuff that are, that FEMA and DHS and a lot of all our EMS and responders are involved in. Those are all very, very important. But everything that we do in this arena costs big dollars. And we can fall in love with response. Now, I've been involved in a response exercise, and I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about this just to give you a flavor for my experience in response. Well, before I get to that, again, you don't have to have an intentional pathogen to be serious. Things like West Nile, Lyme's disease, Nipah, Hendra virus, which are very, very significant biosafety level 4 viruses that have emerged recently in Southeast Asia, the prion diseases, SARS, Marburg and Ebola, avian influenza, H1N1, and a whole bunch of others. So one of the things that I was involved in when I was at Fort Detrick, we responded, there was an introduction of Ebola into the United States. And it's called, we call it the Reston Ebola incident. And so this was in 1990, and monkeys were imported into the United States, and it turns out that some of them started dying, and it turns out that they had Ebola. Luckily, it was within about 50 miles of our laboratory. Nobody was prepared to respond to an emerging disease outbreak like that. Today, there would be a lot of people who would understand what to do, but in those days, there was nobody. The CDC had no idea what they were going to do. We didn't really have a field deployment capability at USAMRIID, but we had worked with Ebola. My wife is an internationally known Ebola researcher, a retired veterinary corps colonel also, and she was one of the primary Ebola researchers at Fort Detrick. We were concerned that the Soviets were trying to develop Ebola as a biowarfare weapon, which has been subsequently proven. These monkeys got Ebola. Well, after it was all over, a guy wrote a book about it called The Hot Zone. Richard Preston wrote a book about it, and we were, it essentially was a nonfiction overview of the emergence of Ebola and this incident that we had in Reston, Virginia, which of course is right in the Washington D.C. metroplex. So we were a big part of this response, and I'm going to show you the thing that was sort of most interesting about this response that happened to us. So there was a movie made about this, and it was loosely based on it, and I wouldn't call this nonfiction. This was very fictionalized, but it was very much patterned on what happened with the Ricin Ebola outbreak. So there was a Hollywood army, and I'm going to contrast with you how the Hollywood army worked and the real army worked. So in the Hollywood army, and this was a movie with Dustin Hoffman and Rene Russo, and they were army scientists, and they responded to this hemorrhagic disease outbreak that was modeled on Ebola here in California. And so at 9 o'clock, they were having all kinds of people dying in this place here in California. And at about 9 o'clock in the morning, they figured out that a monkey that this had come in on a monkey. And so one of the scientists goes on the TV and says, "Anybody seen the monkey?" Well, this lady had been cleaning her daughter's bedroom, and she saw this little picture that her 9-year-old daughter had drawn, and she goes, "My daughter must have seen the monkey. This looks like a monkey that she drew." And so she called them up and says, "I think my daughter's seen the monkey." So they flew up to this lady's house in their helicopter. They jumped out. They went out on her back deck and they cut up some apples and they threw them on the deck, and then they hid in the bushes. Sure enough, out of this redwood forest comes the monkey. Starts eating the apples. They shoot it with a capture gun. They fly back to the place where there are thousands of people that are dying. They take this little monkey that's about the size of a Scotty, and they take enough antibodies out of it, fill a couple tanker trucks, and they save the world. Didn't hurt the monkey now. The monkey's fine. So they saved the world one day. Well, here's what happened to us. We were there for about a week. There were about 500 monkeys in this place. It was always enclosed, always, there was never any chance that anything was going to escape out of it. But we did have one get out. So it was in a room about twice the size of this stage here. So three of us chased this monkey all day long. And, like I say, in a place that's about twice as big as this thing. And, you'll never see it written up in a journal or a magazine, but I'll tell you that if you pump enough ketamine, which is an anesthetic agent, into the tip of the tail of a monkey, it will anesthetize them, because that's what happened. We finally caught, the monkey didn't really want to get caught, and we didn't really want him to, bite anybody if he had Ebola. And so, I love telling this story. I give a talk that just talks about this for about an hour. Because it's funny, but it's true. This is what the reality is of response, in my view. Not that, what the Hollywood army does is what people think is going to happen. They think we're going to come in on our white horse and we're going to save the world in a day. And, my sense is we're more likely, if we don't train and we don't invest, this is what we have happen. And so it's a very, very serious issue. So within the public health community, One Health is a big topic. And One Health is sort of trying to integrate the entire public health community to be prepared for response, both from the emerging disease and from the infectious disease. What we're looking at here, this is in Reston, Virginia, and this is a picture that was taken down there by one of our photographers during the process. So you see that guy sort of in that doorway. That's Colonel C.J. Peters, Clarence Peters. He's a legendary field virologist with both the CDC and with USAMRIID at Fort Detrick, wrote Virus Hunters of the CDC, and he was sort of our overall commander there, and he's yelling down a hallway through a couple doors trying to communicate because this was such an emergency. Nobody knew how to do it. We did it on the fly, and so he's a big part of it. He's of course an infectious disease and tropical medicine specialist. That woman there in the foreground, that's my wife, Colonel Nancy Jaax. She's a veterinary pathologist and an internationally recognized Ebola researcher, and she knew a lot about Ebola. Was the one who figured out how it's really transmitted in sub-Saharan Africa. And you see that guy there in the spacesuit. He's a combat medic who is a research volunteer at USAMRIID, and those are suits that were developed for them to go and pick up somebody in Africa who'd been infected with one of these very dangerous biosafety level 4 organisms. But they were leading us through how to do this, and this woman over on the far left is an Army Nurse Corps officer. So when you look at this, these are, this is One Health in action, and and if the military does something right, this is one of the things they do. They have great teamwork. They put the right expertise on an issue, and they can do it in a really big hurry. And so this is One Health before anybody ever talked about it, and that is that integrated response and healthcare system. So here's the good news. We have heightened awareness, and just the fact that you're here listening to me talk about biowarfare and bioterrorism and emerging disease shows how much difference there is in that awareness, because nobody would have wanted to listen to this stuff. And maybe you don't want to listen either, but that's tough. So we have this increased awareness. We have an accelerated and applied research programs. We have prepositioned materials, and we've improved intelligence and security. And there's been a government reorganization. The whole DHS system has been put together since this happened. Well, here's the bad news. After successful prevention, the next line of defense is the development of new vaccines and antidotes for terror. Well, the Defense Science Board, and this hasn't changed hardly at all, we have only a few of the dozens, and there are 70 or 80 of these that we need countermeasures for. We have a handful of countermeasures for all of these organisms that have been parsed out to be determined to be dangerous and potentially useful as weapons. How many people have heard of Bruce Ivins? Anybody know who that is? Okay, here's the Bruce Ivins dilemma. Bruce Ivins is the guy. He's the guy who's been identified as the Anthrax bomber. This is a guy that I knew well. He worked with us at Fort Detrick. He was a research scientist, and I think the FBI believes that this is the guy. And there's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that he is, but I don't think we'll ever know because he killed himself. But let's just say that he's the guy, or someone like him. He's a biodefense researcher. The guy was, he was an eccentric kind of a guy. I did learn one thing from Dr. Ivins, and that was you should, if we assume that he's the guy who did it, you should never trust somebody who has a clown suit, because he had one. And he would, and he liked to, on Saturdays, outside of his house was real close to the perimeter of Fort Detrick, and he'd go out on Saturday mornings and he'd juggle in his clown suit. So, he was a little weird, let's put it that, but bright guy and one of the lead anthrax researchers. So, let's just say that this guy is the guy that did it. So, if we have somebody who's in the biodefense program or who is an infectious disease specialist, does that mean that we shouldn't do this kind of work? Does that mean that we shouldn't have high hazard laboratories? That mean we shouldn't do biodefense work on these very dangerous pathogens? I don't see how we can think about that in any significant way. The biologic threat clearly remains and, in fact, is increasing. The advancing biotechnology, emerging disease, and global instability are increasing the risks daily. And we need to balance the safety and security with the need to counter emerging diseases and bioterrorism. So, if we look at Dr. Ivins and we say, hey, we should be concerned about him working in these laboratories, well, what about this guy? Where I work, Fort Riley is 10 miles away. So what about some cannon cocker over there who, gets dumped on by his girlfriend and decides to lob a couple rounds into Manhattan? Should we not let them have their artillery? Or should we limit the Air Force with their jets? We can't do that. And so it is a significant question within the biodefense community, and we are struggling with this within the academic and the and government laboratories that deal with these issues. So just a couple words about, there's a new laboratory that's coming to Manhattan, Kansas. It's a DHS facility. And just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that are going on within the government to try to counter the biologic threat, this is a conceptual drawing of the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility. It's a 2009 DHS USDA. It's coming to Manhattan, Kansas, which of course is in north central Kansas. It's a replacement for the Plum Island animal disease quarantine facility. There were about 30 expressions of interest. Manhattan was chosen. It's about $700 million. It's a tough time to be asking for $750 million, I can tell you that. But I think they're breaking ground for the central utility plant within a couple of weeks. So it looks like we're a go. And this is going to have BSL-3, BSL-4, and BSL-3 ag capabilities, which gives us capability to work on virtually any of these diseases that we've talked about. And it should be operational about 8 or 10 years. So, sort of as a wrap-up, the U.S., once again, Senators Graham and Talent, they concluded in hearings in a major study that the U.S. is unprepared for a bioterrorism attack. And they gave the White House and Congress Fs for their emphasis on this. And they said we no longer have the luxury of a slow learning curve when we know Al-Qaeda is interested in bioweapons, and that's for sure. So never has the divide between animal and man been so porous or the threat to public health more urgent, according to Paul Epstein at Harvard. Global travel, overpopulation, urbanization, climate change are speeding the spread of exotic and unfamiliar zoonotic diseases, and we're in the midst of a resurgence of old diseases and new diseases on a global scale. Who would have thought we'd be concerned about tuberculosis? Who would have thought that would be such a huge public health? You want to be scared about something, be scared about drug-resistant tuberculosis. And it would be really nice if we could go back on a simpler, safer, and a happier time. So I showed this slide at a talk I gave in Nebraska a couple years ago, and a guy held up his hand and he said, "Where'd you get that picture of President Bush and Saddam drinking beer together?" And I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. So I said, "Sir, that's classified. We can't tell you where we got those pictures." And infectious disease outbreaks, unfortunately, or terrorist attacks, they're not going to call us and tell us it's going to happen. Most of the time, it's going to be a surprise. So we have to have a little bit of a clue what we're going to do to try to accomplish that. And so we need to plan and prepare. So in Alfred Crosby's tremendous book about the great pandemic influenza of 1918, in the prefix, he said there's a joke circulating among infectious disease experts. The 19th century was followed by the 20th century, which was followed by the 19th century. It was shocking to find out in 2001 that our county public health, only a quarter of our national county public health offices had access to email and think that they were in the 21st century. But things like increased ID research emphasis, public health decrements, limited antibiotic development, vaccine development and production. We're not developing vaccines. We're not developing antibiotics. Reduced vector control, and zero risk tolerance for countermeasures. That goes back to the immunization issue that we talked about. And look what's happened. Remember when we think back to 1969 and the Surgeon General said, we've won the battle against biologic diseases. What about HIV/AIDS, Nipah, chronic wasting disease, SARS, numerous plant diseases, exotic pests, tuberculosis, hantavirus, West Nile, drug-resistant pathogens, avian and pandemic influenza, Marburg and Ebola, Lyme's disease. And that's just a very short list of emerging diseases that have happened in the last couple of decades. And when you overlay that with the fact that there are people out there that would do it on purpose, that would try to do it because they wanted to kill you, that's an issue we have to deal with. So when it comes to emerging disease and bioterrorism, it's hard to know whether we should laugh or cry. But it's obvious we have a lot of heavy lifting to do. The government is spending lots of money on biodefense, and it is a tough nut to crack because it is so hard, and the bar is constantly moving because the increases in the capabilities of virtually anyone to become involved in this. So with that, I will close. And again, I'd like to thank the organizers for asking me, and it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. Thank you.